Children in Mozambique have a smaller chance of surviving their first year of life than anywhere else in the world. Every 8 minutes, war, starvation, or disease claims the life of a Mozambican child. Little boys look like old men. In Mozambique, youth is fleeting. 25 years of armed conflict has severely wounded Africa's poorest nation. Mozambique's economy is wrecked. Over 1 million peasant farmers have fled their homes to refugee camps where they live on food handouts. Once fertile fields are scorched wastelands. Famine threatens a quarter of the population. Mozambique's people are struggling for survival. Africa's hottest bush war is being fought by the government of Frelimo, a Portuguese acronym for the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, which led the country to independence, and a South African-backed rebel movement, the Mozambique National Resistance, known as the MNR, or by its Portuguese acronym, RENAMO. While Western nations are increasing their aid to the Frelimo government, RENAMO has launched a drive in the United States to portray its rebels as anti-communist freedom fighters worthy of American support. Yet RENAMO has spread violence and destruction across Mozambique and permanently scarred its 14 million people. The crisis in Mozambique is partly due to centuries of neglect by its former Portuguese colonial rulers and grave mistakes by the Frelimo government. But Mozambique is also a victim of geography. Its fate has been caught up in the violent struggles against white minority rule in neighboring South Africa and in Rhodesia, which is today the independent nation of Zimbabwe. Since Mozambique gained independence from Portugal in 1975, South Africa has used a variety of economic and military weapons to shatter the Frelimo government's dream of building the first non-racial socialist state in southern Africa. While the debate rages in the West about imposing economic sanctions against South Africa, Pretoria has used sanctions of its own to punish Mozambique. Intensive South African military aid and training have helped RENAMO to expand its raids to all 10 of Mozambique's provinces. And Pretoria has resorted to direct attacks on Mozambique, raiding the capital, Maputo, 3 times over the past 6 years. When a charismatic guerrilla commander named Samora Machel led Mozambique to independence in 1975, he sent shockwaves throughout Africa. Mozambique became the symbol of African freedom in a region dominated by the white minority. Frelimo's victory inspired thousands of young blacks next door in Ian Smith's Rhodesia to join the fight for a free Zimbabwe. In South Africa, African nationalists could finally see the end of the apartheid system drawing near. The heady air of revolution filled Mozambique. Frelimo began to implement its populist program. Rural Mozambicans who had never seen a teacher or a doctor could suddenly attend schools and medical clinics. Inoculation drives against easily preventable diseases saved thousands of lives. But the idealism of those early independence days has now been consumed by despair and fear of attacks by the RENAMO rebels, who are commonly known as bandidos armados, or armed bandits.
I don't want to go back home. It's not safe there. There's too much killing there. The bandits are all over Changang. I don't know where to go.
Years of war have wiped out much of the precious gains in health and education since independence. Mozambicans now fear for the future. After guiding his nation through 2 decades of guerrilla struggle and independence, President Samora Machel was killed in a mysterious plane crash in October 1986 in South Africa. Today, Mozambique lies crippled, the revolution paralyzed. The seeds of today's crisis were planted 400 years ago when Portuguese explorers landed on Mozambique's Indian Ocean shores. Portugal itself was poor, and its colonial rule was a time of shocking exploitation. 1 million people were sold into slavery, and many who were left in Mozambique worked as forced labor to supply raw materials for Portugal's industries. Men were sent off as wage laborers, while the women were forced to grow cotton. There was no time to grow food. Famine was a constant threat in the countryside. Forced black labor also built Mozambique's 3 major railroad systems. The railways allowed the Portuguese and the white settlers to the eastern Rhodesia to send minerals and cash crops to ships waiting at the Indian Ocean and out of Africa. Southern Mozambique became a reserve of cheap labor for the mines in neighboring South Africa. During colonial times, education and medical care for blacks were ignored. Mozambique was a playground for South African and Rhodesian tourists. By the time the Portuguese left, 93% of Mozambique's people could not read or write. As the tide of nationalism swept across Africa in the early 1960s, a small band of revolutionaries formed the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, Frelimo, and began training guerrilla fighters. Frelimo's revolutionary message spread quickly in the north. The guerrillas ran school programs and medical clinics for peasants. Farmers were organized into cooperatives. Frelimo guerrillas were battling a Portuguese army that had far superior firepower supplied by the West and South Africa. But Portugal's troops grew weary of fighting colonial wars. Frelimo's advance against the Portuguese heartened nationalist guerrillas across the border in Rhodesia and filled Ian Smith's white government with alarm. Smith knew that if Portugal left Mozambique, Frelimo would come to power and provide bases for the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, the main guerrilla movement fighting for majority rule in Rhodesia. So Rhodesia set up its own force in Mozambique to counter the ZANLA guerrillas. That secret army was called the Mozambique National Resistance, the same rebel movement that has brought Mozambique to the brink of collapse today. The creator of RENAMO was Ken Flower, Rhodesia's former intelligence chief.
The actual start of this movement, in practical terms, dates to about 1969, 1970. And we called it then the Mozambique Resistance. And their main function was, in fact, to tell us what ZANLA were doing. ZANLA had to pass through their villages. They used carriers sometimes. So they were reporting on their mates on this side of the border. Bearing in mind, of course, that these borders are very artificial lines across a map.
The war intensified. Peasants were caught in the crossfire of the Portuguese and Frelimo armies. The widening conflict left a huge power vacuum in Mozambique, seized by Ken Flower's intelligence agents who built up their secret army.
There was general discontent and dissatisfaction. Far from us having any difficulty in recruiting people, if we had given way to it, they would have flocked to our organization. Those who came to us in the first instance were clearly dissatisfied with their handling by the Portuguese or by Frelimo, or by both. Some of the best men we had in the earliest days were defectors from Frelimo. It gave them, strangely, a way of life.
Portuguese rule in Mozambique collapsed when the military took power thousands of miles away in Lisbon in April 1974. The next year, Portugal turned Mozambique over to Frelimo. For Mozambique's whites, the battle to preserve their privileged lifestyle was over. Most fled to Portugal and South Africa, destroying much of what they had built and smuggling millions of dollars out of the country. Today, working conditions at the world's biggest coconut plantation in northern Mozambique have improved little since independence. When Frelimo came to power, Portuguese ships steamed away with the entire 1975 crop worth $4 million. It was this kind of looting by the fleeing colonialists that helped bankrupt Mozambique on the very eve of its independence. The new government's early policies made matters worse. Frelimo pumped scarce resources into inefficient state farms and neglected the very peasant farmers who had supported the independence struggle. Thousands of peasants were moved into communal villages where they were provided with schools, medical clinics, and water, but lacked adequate money and tools to farm effectively. Forcing people into communal villages angered peasants and provided fresh recruits for Rhodesia's Renamo movement. At the same time, Ian Smith's white government was losing its own war against the nationalist guerrillas who were pouring over Rhodesia's northeastern border from Mozambique. And from Mozambique's capital, Maputo, the nationalists broadcast their revolutionary message to millions of blacks in Rhodesia. The Rhodesians hit back at Mozambique. In 1976 and 1977, the Rhodesian Air Force bombed camps of Zimbabweans at Chimoio and Niadzonia, killing over 1,000 civilians. And they helped Renamo to step up attacks on the Frelimo government. Renamo was being transformed from a small band of Rhodesian informers into the devastating military force it has become today.
Then we went into propaganda, which was probably a mistake. We used some Portuguese to assist in that regard. And of course, they had to move into the political sphere to dig out the sort of propaganda which, rightly or wrongly, was believed would help the movement. And it did, therefore, to that extent, become anti-Frelimo.
Renamo's tactics were becoming more brutal, too. The rebels began to mutilate civilians in a bid to undermine Frelimo's authority in the countryside and to force peasants to comply with their orders.
There were reports of atrocities, the intimidatory processes, especially the cutting off of ears and noses. And this did happen in the fairly early days.
One such victim is Carolina Sacra. Renamo rebels used a machete to cut off her nose when they attacked her village in the northern province of Nampula.
We were in a communal village when the bandits came out of the jungle and attacked. Some people were wounded. Some were killed. We sent out a call to Frelimo troops and they chased the bandits away. The people who were able to run got away. The people who could not were killed.
Such tactics have earned Renamo the reputation of being one of the world's most ruthless rebel groups. They do little to build popular support. And unlike most guerrilla movements, Renamo has failed to project a political alternative to the government in power.
With new people coming into the movement, of course, there were those who could see the opportunity of self-aggrandizement, who had political aspirations. Of course, that is so. But at no stage did they produce anybody in the nature of a political leader. At no stage did the movement have its own political aspiration.
The nationalist guerrillas in Rhodesia finally forced the British government to negotiate a settlement that ushered in Zimbabwe's independence in 1980. The Rhodesians had no choice but to cut ties with the rebels. But then South Africa's white minority government stepped in to keep Renamo operating.
So the members of the resistance were told that there was that alternative. We thinking that none of them would be interested. On the contrary, the majority, in fact, showed that interest. So this is what we did. We made the arrangements in the few days between making the decision in principle and the actual handover to effect a transfer to the South Africans.
The independence of Zimbabwe left South Africa as the sole bastion of white rule in southern Africa. As President Michel celebrated with Zimbabwe's new Prime Minister Robert Mugabe, he was unaware that South Africa was busy building Renamo into its own secret counter-revolutionary army in Mozambique. Within a year of Zimbabwe's independence, Renamo units trained in South Africa crossed into Mozambique. An ex-Renamo soldier explains how the South Africans set up a network of supply drops in southern Mozambique.
We would build fires in a big circle. Then the planes would come and parachute us supplies, arms, and ammunition. I never saw the South Africans in the bush, but I was introduced to them at the base. There were two groups of them, a reconnaissance group and a group of commanders.
In tandem with sponsoring Renamo, South Africa also hit Mozambique with economic sanctions. Mozambique lost millions of dollars as Pretoria boycotted the port of Maputo, which it once relied upon to export coal and other minerals. Another heavy blow fell when Pretoria cut the number of Mozambican workers in South Africa. Mozambicans working in South Africa's mines have passed through the Rossano Garcia border post for over a century. Pretoria still relies on cheap labor from all over southern Africa to mine its huge deposits of gold, which are critical to the South African economy, while Mozambique relies on the hard currency its miners earn in South Africa to purchase vital imports. But after independence, South Africa ordered thousands of Mozambicans to leave. These miners are coming home. Their contracts have run out, and they will not be coming back. Pretoria has cut the number of Mozambicans in its mines from 115,000 to 40,000 since independence. The loss in foreign exchange earnings has staggered Mozambique, for there are no jobs for these miners to come back to. Mozambique also felt the power of the South African military. In January 1981, South African commandos raided the industrial suburb of Matola, just outside the capital, Maputo. They attacked two houses of the African National Congress, the main group fighting for majority rule in South Africa. 13 South Africans and a Portuguese electrician were killed. The commandos left behind one British mercenary. Since then, South Africa has attacked Mozambique in 1983, killing a Mozambican child and 3 Mozambican workers at a jam factory, and again in 1987, killing a night watchman in a residential suburb and 2 other Mozambican civilians. Infusions of South African military supplies strengthened Renamo. Rebel units spread throughout southern Mozambique and opened up a new front in the north. Frelimo was losing ground on the battlefield. Drought gripped the south. While planes from South Africa parachuted supplies to Renamo, rebel attacks blocked the delivery of United Nations food relief. In 1983, 100,000 Mozambicans starved to death in the war zone. President Michel sought to end the war in March 1984 by signing a peace pact with the leader of South Africa's white government, P.W. Botha. The pact, known as the Nkomati Accord of Non-Aggression and Good Neighborliness, committed South Africa to stop supporting Renamo. In return, Mozambique would not allow guerrillas from the African National Congress, the ANC, to use its territory to launch attacks on South Africa. The driving force behind the Nkomati Accord, President Michel, has died. Michel's successor is former Foreign Minister Joaquim Chissano, also a veteran of the Independence War. In style, the cool intellectual Chissano stands in sharp contrast to Michel, the spellbinding orator. The pace of economic and military reform has accelerated since President Chissano took office in October 1986, but he says there will be no change in Mozambique's respect for the Nkomati Accord.
We support the struggle of the South African people, led by the ANC. The only thing which we cannot do is to help ANC to undertake violent actions in South Africa. This we have committed ourselves not to do, but otherwise we support ANC politically, morally, diplomatically.
Mozambique honored its side of the deal. Frelimo hoped that if South Africa did the same, Renamo would gradually fade away. But, as it did when Zimbabwe gained independence 4 years before, Mozambique misjudged Pretoria's intentions. The war did not die down. It intensified, thanks to continued South African support. Documents captured from Renamo's main base in 1985 confirmed that South Africa was still airlifting arms to the rebels in violation of the Nkomati Peace Accord signed a year before. Main roads and railways. Without those transport routes operating, southern African nations have no choice but to ship their goods through South Africa. Mozambique is a natural gateway to the outside world for its neighbors. 3 of southern Africa's major transport routes cross Mozambique to the Indian Ocean. They are critical to the region's economy, but now they are prime targets of the South African-backed rebels. Today, the Beira Corridor, Mozambique's only functioning transport route, is at the heart of the war. Nervous young recruits scan the bush, alert for rockets fired by Renamo. War has become routine in this part of Mozambique. Only during the safety of daylight do villagers dare to barter their wares on roadside markets as listless soldiers shuffle by. Renamo tries to destroy the 200-mile-long corridor because its earnings help the government. Mozambique and its neighbors say they must keep it open if the entire region is to survive economic sanctions by South Africa. Major General Domingos Fondo is one of Mozambique's most effective military commanders. He says Renamo's sabotage of Mozambique's transport routes is South Africa's means of maintaining a tight grip on the economies of southern Africa.
They cut everything, so these countries have to depend on it. Those that border South Africa, they are the principal targets. They are always playing with countries.
After Renamo attacked the oil pipeline that supplies all of Zimbabwe's fuel needs, it was clear that Frelimo could no longer defend the route alone. So 6,000 Zimbabwean troops took up defensive positions along the Beira corridor in July 1985. And today, Zimbabwe troops and armored personnel carriers patrol the vital road link to ward off Renamo attacks. Just a month after they arrived, the Zimbabweans scored the biggest victory of the war, capturing Renamo's headquarters at Gorongosa, just north of the Beira corridor. Then Renamo pushed north into Mozambique's richest provinces, Tete and Zambezia. Hundreds of thousands of civilians fled their homes as Renamo routed government troops from the Zambezi River Valley. By October 1986, Renamo appeared ready to cut Mozambique in two. 1 million people were homeless. Hungry peasant farmers were refugees in their own land. District after district was being destroyed by continuing Renamo attacks and Frelimo counterattacks. There was little left of the northwestern town of Ulongwe after Frelimo and Renamo clashed in December 1986. Ulongwe lies in one of Mozambique's breadbaskets, the region of Angonia. Yet once the fighting ended, much of the year's harvest was left to rot. A pattern of robbery and assault had developed in the countryside.
When we got to a village, the first thing we would do is take everything, like clothes and motorbikes. Then we would round up all the villagers and march them away. Later we would ask, who are the people who work with the government? Who hold important positions? Who are the teachers? And who are the members of Frelimo? They would all be killed. They ordered me to carry my things to their base. When we got there, they told us to put the goods down. As I was bending over, they chopped the back of my head.
Renamo's offensive was finally halted in February 1987 when Zimbabwean troops launched a lightning raid on the northern town of Mutarara and captured one of Mozambique's key transport routes, the 5-mile-long rail bridge over the Zambezi River. The bridge is a vital link from the rich coal fields in the town of Moatize to the port of Beira. Coal exports from Moatize alone could earn Mozambique $25 million a year in hard currency. The Mutarara attack signaled a deeper commitment from Zimbabwe to Mozambique's war, for this embattled town is far north of Zimbabwe's usual area of operations along the Beira corridor. Zimbabwean troops retook the area by using helicopters to airlift in elite paratroopers. Within 2 days, they had routed hundreds of Renamo rebels from Mutarara and several nearby towns on the Zambezi River. Renamo fighters who did not flee north to neighboring Malawi stood little chance. Scores were killed, wounded, and taken prisoner. Renamo controlled Mutarara for 4 months. The big stores of arms and the South African radios left behind suggest Renamo was planning to build a major base there. Hundreds of civilians survived the battle, but they were left destitute. Today, Mutarara is just a shell of a town. The story of Mutarara was repeated throughout central and northern Mozambique. The war refugees moved to resettlement camps far from their original homes. Moatis, once famous for the giant coal reserves that used to be railed over the bridge at Mutarara, is today a symbol of Mozambique's refugee crisis. The same trains that shipped the coal have become temporary homes for thousands of war refugees. Most come from villages in the east, destroyed by the fighting at the end of 1986. They are among the 200,000 Mozambicans who fled to the neighboring country of Malawi. Since early 1987, they have been flooding to the Moatis rail yards outside the provincial capital of Tete. They arrive dressed in rags with no money and no food. Whole families come, sometimes whole villages. The lucky ones live in the empty boxcars. Others sleep under the trailers or out in the open. Youngsters try to continue their schooling. Adults while away the days in 105-degree heat. The international community has launched an emergency program to avert full-scale famine in Mozambique. But the arrival of the food relief can hardly keep pace with the rising tide of refugees. By the end of 1987, 70,000 people were expected to pass through Moatis on their way to resettlement on the Zambezi River. Having lost homes and relatives to the war, the refugees at Moatis are fighting to maintain the semblance of a normal daily routine. Other victims of the conflict are less fortunate. They lie in poorly equipped hospitals, maimed by a war they know little about.
I don't know why they should come and kill us old people. There's nothing we can do. They have guns and machetes, and we have nothing to defend ourselves with. We would ask for a cow, and when they showed us where the cattle were, we would steal all of them. Then we would kill the owner of the cattle so he could not report us to the government forces.
Bandits came and started to beat me. Carolina saw this and tried to run away, but the bandits grabbed her and started to stab her with bayonets.
We would cut women and children and chop off their ears. Sometimes we would cut their heads off and put them on the road.
I left my husband and 3 children. During the attack, some of the children ran away. Some were killed.
We knew what we were doing was wrong, but there was nothing we could do. We had to carry out our orders. The bandits cut off 2 fingers on each hand. They hit me on the back of my head until my nose started bleeding. After they finished beating me, I ran to the hospital. I really don't know. Those were our orders. We preferred to attack civilians and cause havoc because we could see we could not defeat the army. Anytime the army would attack our base, we would suffer. Men would lose an arm or a leg. But we preferred to cause havoc in the countryside. When they attacked us, we took revenge against civilians.
"4 years of drought and the South African-sponsored war have proved to be a deadly combination for Mozambique. The war forces more and more farmers off their land. Refugee camps swell outside government-controlled cities. 4.5 million Mozambicans are threatened by famine, but many of them cannot be reached because of Renamo attacks. Tons of food relief have poured into Mozambique from Western countries in the United Nations, but much of the food has to be shipped up the Indian Ocean coast to provincial ports, for Renamo attacks make the roads too dangerous. With its economy crumbling, Mozambique is now, under the guidance of the International Monetary Fund, using free market policies to breathe new life into industry and farming. Mozambique's socialist government welcomes private investment from home and abroad. It has removed ceilings on prices for many goods and has become massive devaluations of the local currency, the metical. The changes are painful. Prices are soaring for the few goods on sale in the shops along Maputo's broad avenues. And sharp cuts in state spending have swelled the ranks of the unemployed. Though Western nations are backing Frelimo's effort with millions of dollars in aid, Mozambique still lacks the foreign exchange it needs to import the spare parts that keep industry and transport running. The new free market policies are helping to increase food supplies for rapidly growing cities. Just 2 years ago, this market in downtown Maputo was empty. Food began appearing as soon as the government allowed farmers to set their own prices. But for the average Mozambican, the high costs are often beyond reach. For many, the only way to pay for the food is to deal on the candonga, as the huge black market is known. The government hopes that higher food prices will encourage farmers to produce more. It also wants to strengthen Frelimo's popularity in the countryside at a time when military pressure from Renamo is increasing. But the government's new policies can help only those farmers living in safe areas. The war has closed off wide tracts of land to farming. Guruwe is a rich tea-producing area in the mountains of the northern province of Zambezia. Its tea plantations could provide hundreds of jobs and earn Mozambique millions of dollars in hard currency. But these green fields were burned in February of 1987 when 500 Renamo rebels set fire to the plantations. Fertile land and large mineral deposits make Zambezia Mozambique's wealthiest province. It once produced 60% of the country's export earnings. But farms all over Zambezia have been destroyed by Renamo. Government troops have been guarding the giant coconut plantation at Macuz since a Renamo raid in 1986. Rebel mortar fires slammed into the company office buildings. Today, work continues under a constant threat of attack. Zambezia is the new war front. In December 1986, Frelimo launched its strongest counteroffensive ever, with help from Zimbabwe and Tanzania. As Renamo was pushed back toward the west, the rebels fanned out into neighboring provinces. Although Frelimo is now winning back lost territory, over the past decade the army has not been strong enough to deliver a knockout blow to Renamo. Each time the government gains the initiative, South Africa steps in with greater support for Renamo. Frelimo's army is battling its own internal problems as well. Soldiers go for days without food and basic supplies. Army provisions turn up for sale on the black market. Discipline breaks down. In some cases, hungry Frelimo soldiers rob villagers. Incompetence and corruption in the army have been the main targets in President Chissano's battle to reform the military. It is a battle he appears to be winning. In June 1987, Chissano named a new Armed Forces Chief of Staff and new military commanders in 9 out of 10 provinces. One of those named to a new post is Major General Domingos Fondo. General Fondo now leads the Frontier Guards in halting Renamo border crossings from South Africa and Malawi. While he was a provincial commander, Frelimo troops retook control of the southern province of Inhambane from Renamo. General Fondo is one of Mozambique's model commanders. His troops are well fed and well drilled. Morale is high. In its drive to rebuild the army, Mozambique sends hundreds of soldiers for military training each year. The instructors used to come mainly from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. But as the war has become more severe, Mozambique has looked to its neighbors, Tanzania and Zimbabwe, and to the west for more military assistance. The British government has responded to the overture to the West. However, in the United States, conservatives in Congress have blocked a Reagan administration proposal to provide non-lethal military aid, such as boots and uniforms. Today, British military instructors train 300 Mozambican junior officers in Zimbabwe. Frelimo is counting on these officers to lead Mozambique to victory in the war against Renamo. But an outright victory by either side is nowhere in sight. The government is trying to end the conflict by pressing ahead with a military campaign while offering amnesty to Renamo troops, and a small number of rebels have turned themselves in. Still, President Chissano rules out direct negotiations with the rebels.
Negotiate with whom? Who are they? The terrorists? Are these people real Mozambicans? Do they want power? Do they want to rule the country? Well, do they want to rule a country with people without hairs, without breasts, without nose?
A peaceful end to the conflict was Frelimo's aim in signing the Nkomati Accord with South Africa in 1984. but Pretoria repeatedly violated the agreement by continuing to sponsor Renamo. Yet South Africa's own internal crisis may force a lessened commitment to the rebels. Thus, Renamo is seeking new backers. The rebels are using anti-communist rhetoric to try to convince the major Western powers to step in with support, just as South Africa did when Zimbabwe gained independence from Rhodesia in 1980. Britain is standing firmly behind the Frelimo government, making Mozambique its single biggest aid recipient, while the United States is sending food and development aid to Mozambique. The rebels have launched a drive to win Washington's backing for their war. The consequences of such an escalation would be disastrous for Mozambique. Already, the war, mass migrations of refugees, and bitter poverty are tearing the country apart. A new generation of Mozambicans knows nothing but hunger and war. Thousands of youngsters sit in refugee camps and hospitals, nursing mental and physical wounds.
I saw the bandits killing my parents, so I ran away to hide in the bush. I want them to be beaten and removed from this country. Some of them come from outside the country and join up with some people who are dissatisfied with the government and cause havoc. The bandits are just like a ghost that come to terrorize us.
The war in Mozambique has begun spilling over into neighboring countries. Renamo is infiltrating across the border into Zimbabwe to steal food and clothes from peasants. In mid-June 1987, 50 Renamo gunmen burned a northeastern Zimbabwean village at midnight and shot dead 11 civilians, including 5 children. The rebels vow future raids against Zimbabwe and the other southern African states that are supporting Mozambique. Renamo has come full circle. The rebels are attacking the same land, Zimbabwe, where the movement was formed by Ken Flower's Rhodesian intelligence agents almost 20 years ago.
I don't think it would be fair to say that it became too much of a monster at that stage, but there was always this danger that it would run away with itself.
The war started spinning out of control the day the Rhodesians handed Renamo over to South Africa. Today, the conflict is a rapidly expanding proxy war between South Africa and the rest of the region. Southern Africa's majority-ruled states are sending troops and aid to help the Mozambican government to defeat rebels sponsored by South Africa. The fate of Mozambique is the key to the future of the entire region. As long as Renamo attacks halt traffic on Mozambique's strategic transport routes, Southern Africa remains locked into South Africa's economy. For that reason, Mozambique and its neighbors expect no let-up in the war until the apartheid system falls in South Africa.
Actually, they have nothing to demand from us. We, on the contrary, because we are part of the international community, we have something to demand from them, is that apartheid be abolished. Because this is the cause of destabilization.
As darkness falls on Maputo, Mozambicans grumble about food shortages and high prices. They worry, too, that tomorrow may bring another attack by South Africa. At refugee camps throughout the countryside, peasants end their daily chores, hoping that tonight they have escaped the war's reach.